Alonso. I'm the chair of the planning committee for this year's epidemiology and lifestyle scientific sessions, and I'm very pleased to be here today with our keynote speakers. The theme of our conference this year was what money has to do with it, and we have tried to cover the interplay between policy, economics, and cardiovascular health. And what I would like to do now is ask individually each one of our speakers if they can talk a little about what the main ideas in their talks were. So we will start with Dr. Karen Joynt Maddox, who was the first speaker. And please, Karen, if you can tell us a little about the work, your talk and what you talk about.
Sure, thank you. So, my goal in this address was to really communicate to the cardiovascular community why policy is one of the tools that we should consider as part of what we can do to improve cardiovascular health. So often we think about individual interventions. We think about an individual drug or an individual food coaching or things that we might do to impact the individual. But if we think about things that could be impactful more broadly, then we can add things like health policy to our armamentarium. So we can think about healthcare coverage, who has access to care based on having health insurance. We can think about healthcare payment. So what do we value when we set up what we pay for in healthcare? And then we can think more broadly in a policy sense about how we might invest in education, in healthy communities, in changes to our tax policy in order to actually allow people to achieve their best health throughout the life course, which fundamentally starts well before we usually see people in clinic with their adult onset cardiovascular disease. So it really is to try to take our lens both broader in terms of the types of policies that we can think about in this cardiovascular space, and also earlier in the types of things that we think about that are structural and systemic and touch people from birth to the environment in which they grow.
Thank you so much. Our second speaker was Dr. Dhruv Kazi. So Kazi, if you can tell us a little about what was the content of your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. A focus of my talk was understanding the complex relationship between economics and cardiovascular epidemiology and cardiovascular outcomes, recognizing that individuals who are low income are disadvantaged all the way through from increased cardiovascular risk to inadequate access and then worse outcomes after they have access to healthcare. And to think about how we solve this, both from the perspective of interventions within the healthcare system and more globally through societal interventions. So important things in addition to what Dr. Maddox mentioned about coverage and payment, from my perspective, we've got to really figure out how to tackle price of drugs and devices and therapies that we offer or programs that we offer, because if we can tie the price of these products to the value they generate for us as in terms of health or social returns, then we can use those savings to incentivize individuals, to clinicians and individual people in society to make better life choices on cardiovascular prevention and treatment. And then I pointed out, of course, that all of this is likely to get, all of the stress that we think of related to income and cardiovascular outcomes are likely to get worse in the context of climate change. As a reminder, already low-income individuals have increased exposure to environmental pollutants and extreme heat, and we're going to have to solve this problem whether we want it or not. And then finally, income is such a powerful driver, income and education is such a powerful driver of our inequities that we've got to get to the root of the problem. I mean, we've got to figure out taxation policy and education policy more broadly.
Thank you. Very ambitious.
Yeah.
Thanks. And our final speaker was Dr. Alice Lichtenstein. And please, Alice, if you can tell us a little about what you talked about.
Sure. So my focus was on healthy dietary patterns, particularly heart-healthy dietary patterns, and that generally as a nation, we're not doing particularly well regardless of the age group, and that there sometimes is a myth that healthy diets have to be more expensive. Now, we do know that those individuals in the lower income strata do pay a higher percent of their income or for food, and that their diets don't tend to be as healthy as those in the higher income strata. What we don't always appreciate is that in some cases it is due to availability, In some cases, though, it's due to things like importance of health, importance of prevention, literacy, health literacy, science literacy, and that we have not been doing a particularly good job in really educating people. And then also working within the context of what people normally eat, what they prefer to eat from an ethnic, cultural perspective, that it's not just that there's one heart healthy diet and either you follow that or you don't follow that. But within anyone's diet, there are ways of shifting to a healthier dietary pattern that's more compatible with cardiovascular health, cardiometabolic health, and it does not necessarily have to cost more money. However, one needs to be aware of where shifts can be made that are practical and where shifts can be made that aren't practical. And I also mentioned that it's important to invest in the future, and that is we have to provide food and nutrition education in grades K through 12. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to provide information, whether it be at point of purchase or on a menu about the food and nutrition, but we don't really teach people how to use it. So why spend all that time doing it? So I think there's a lot of potential, and we may need to reorient ourselves a little bit.
Thank you so much. So to end this conversation, I wanted to ask each one of you, maybe if you can tell us individually what has been more interesting to you, maybe from what the other speakers have talked about, and maybe from the questions you have received. You have been also involved with the networking tables. Maybe there have been conversations there that were somehow unexpected. So if you can tell us a little about maybe something new you have learned or something that really has surprised you. Maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Joynt Maddox.
Sure. So
just briefly.
I guess I was struck by the similarity between the costs of food and the costs of prescription drugs. And that when we're thinking about how people achieve health, they are making choices about how to balance. What do they eat? How do they achieve housing, shelter, sort of basic needs? And then where down the line might prescription drugs fall when you're treating something like hypertension that you might not feel? And that's a much less immediate need than putting food on the table. And so really it sort of tied together for me that moving back to things like child tax credits and making sure that people have affordable access to healthy food and that we have affordable access to drugs, so that the people who are in the position of having to make these just impossible choices are not ever put in that position to begin with. And so I think both of these things, right, that are both sort of essential to achieving cardiovascular health are under the same pressures. And if we think about sort of broader ways to help people make those choices in a positive way, then we will likely achieve better cardiovascular health down the road.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kazi, I don't know if you have something to add.
Yeah, I think I loved one of Karen's slides about rural inequities. This idea that we kind of have now taken inequities for granted. Of course, rural outcomes are worse than urban outcomes, but this was not always the case. That right through the 1980s, we had nearly the lines track almost superimposed on each other, and the fact that so much of the most striking inequity in the U.S. is a relatively recent phenomenon gives me hope that we can be ambitious about reversing it. If we built it over 3 decades, maybe over a decade, we can fix it. And maybe we need ambitious solutions rather than thinking about these incrementally.
Yeah, actually a minimum wage that you brought up too, the lack of growth in minimum wage to sort of erode the middle class, right, and people's opportunity to have food and shelter and prescription drugs is also a relatively recent phenomenon, right? It feels like it's always been that way to some degree when you think about the deep-seated nature of these inequities, but it hasn't.
No, I mean, we are now in the longest stretch without an increase in the federal minimum wage since the federal minimum wage was established in the 1930s. There's been no change since 2009, and that's a 46% reduction in the federal minimum wage once you account for inflation. It's crazy, but it's recent. Right. We can fix it.
And that really impacts on how much food and what types of food people can afford. But I'm also struck, and this came up in our roundtable conversation, about how we don't put a lot of emphasis on helping people navigate the current food environment, which is very complex because there's a lot of foods that are very consistent with what we want to encourage people to consume, and then there are a lot of foods that are not. But it might help us if we all work more together, because it is a balance, as you just said, between how much you pay for drugs, how much you pay for food, and then housing, and they are tracking together. So probably a more holistic perspective and approach to improving the landscape, I think, would benefit us all.
Thank you. I think that this has been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank again our three keynote speakers for being available to talk with us about the fantastic work they are doing. And I want to encourage all of you attending the conference to really enjoy the rest of 2 days and a half of oral presentations, posters, opportunities for networking, and to develop your own career. So thank you very much.